So good morning, everybody. So I'm extremely happy to see you all here. Sorry it took us a while to get prepared, but so my name is Lyudmila Alyabieva. I am director of PhD program in art and design here at Art and Design School, Higher School of Economics, and this is our first individual, independent conference. So please bear that in mind. And I'm extremely happy to see my colleagues from different countries here and our colleagues from Russia who are here with us. So you can see how long, big, and beautiful the program is. And of course, I would love to listen to every presentation myself. Hopefully, I will be able to do that. So just a few words. So you see, we have 3 days. 2 days will be located here. So we are going to stay here. But this evening, tonight, those who are interested in Esther Shalev-Gertz, our guest from France, artist, I guess you all know her work. So she will be giving an artist talk at the Jewish Museum. So those who are interested, you can go after the sections, after the panels are over. Tomorrow we'll stay here all the time. And on the 12th of April, we have whole day at Electro Theatre Stanislavski because it will be Performance Studies Day. So we'll have a combination of academic talks, roundtables, and also performances. So you're welcome. And I'd like to now just give word to Deputy Dean of the whole Higher School of Economics, and Tatiana Rivchuna will say a few words, and she will also be moderating this first panel. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Good morning, and I'm glad to see you here in the building of the HSC Art and Design School. Very briefly, Lyudmila, by the way, is not only the head of the PhD program, but she's also the organizer of the conference, and not only of the conference, but a lot of activities connected with the research, connected with fashion, and she's doing a lot of work. So this is, in a way, we are sitting here because she made a great work. So now a few words. Lyudmila said that we are independent. In a way, this year we are starting the first time the conference in our building here in the Art and Design School. In general, we are not independent. I mean, we are part of the High School of Economics. We are part of the Faculty of Communication, Media and Design, and we are happy to be part of all of this. Because I think that nowadays integration of everything is very important. And today, and during all these 3 days, I think that we have a very interesting program. And we have a lot of very detailed questions which we have to answer and to listen to. But in general, when we started two years ago, when we started the research program in Art and Design School, we were asking ourselves, what are we going to do? And what questions are we going to answer? And what message are we going to give to the world? And so it is quite interesting what we asked ourselves and what we answered. We don't want to be the normal PhD program which is doing the normal classical works. We want to be within the context of today, and the context is changing very rapidly. And the context is really so dependent on the many things, and of course it's dependent on the technologies, because technologies are developing. And if 10 years ago education was absolutely independent from research, now it's difficult to say where is the end and where is the edge of education, research, where is the edge between art and not art. And I think that in general now it is the time of very strange edges, because the edges sometimes appear in the places where they shouldn't appear and disappear where we want to find them. And so this is, in a way, is also one of the problems which we are trying to, in our school, to research, because I think it is also, independently from separate topics, it's very interesting to understand And why it is important? Because we are the university, and now we, in the Art and Design School, we have 2,000 students, and not all of them are doing research. In our PhD program, there are at the moment only 30 students, even 21 students. But we are only the second year, we are existing only for the second year. But in general, the research is part of the education in our school. And I hope that during all these 3 days, and Ludmila said that we will have different spaces for our conference, and it was also one of the ideas when we started that research shouldn't be in one place and performance should be in the other place. We, from the beginning, decided that it will be in the same place mentally and in the same place sometimes physically. And so this is also one of the principles of our research school.
So Sarah, thank you so much for accepting the invitation and for coming here. It's a great honor for us that you are going to open our conference. And Sarah is going to speak on culture and emigration, crowds and power. Sarah Wilson, KULTURA, Institute of Art, London University. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This is as much fashion as you are going to get this morning, because this is my own personal anti-Brexit outfit for the demonstration in Parliament Square with my friend Adrien Sina, who made this superb poster, which, as you can see, puts the X of Brexit into the word xenophobic, which means hating foreigners. And I'm talking to you, of course, at a very great moment of crisis and dismay and shock for my traumatized country, which I didn't expect even this time last year when I was having wonderful presentation about fairy tales. We've gone a long way from fairy tales to Tanya. Thank you. So I'm taking as serious the title I was given of the overall theme, which was Theories and Practices of Art and Design, Social, Socio-Cultural, Economic and Political Contexts. And this idea of the theorizing of what is happening in crowds is particularly interesting to me. Also, in terms of the fact that there has to be a Russian element in my talk, and there's a Russian element in everything, possibly including Brexit, I thought I took this particular photo during the demonstration on my camera, where you can see Russian subversion. Not yet, of course, 100% proven, but we're in this period of destabilizing democracies where the media of destabilization is what's so important. So the history of crowds, of course, goes right back to the very first representations of the proletariat. This is a pre-futurist representation of the so-called Fourth Estate, the workers. Very, very famous work by Giuseppe Polizza da Volpedo. So what is interesting is this idea of the coming into representation of a whole class of people hitherto excluded from the fine arts. But in terms nowadays, and then this was my little spiel, which needed more than a subtitle. It says, the long history of theorizing crowds coincides with the history of working class revolution and protest. The increasing sophistication of means of propaganda and the use of new media, from newspapers, radio, photography, film and TV, to the fine arts and the medium of exhibition installation. My very short presentation is highly selective. It shows theories whose impact must be read cumulatively and relates to certain artworks. These have marked my own career as a Western art historian. Inasmuch as I can't be comprehensive, I'm actually talking about things that have made me think, which is useful perhaps for you. My own career focus, which began, as you know, focusing on Paris and extending to Europe and wider histories involving diasporas, including Russian artists. The Russia-USSR story is not presented here, including photo montage, but also social realism, and of course Russian new media and so forth. I begin and end in the present. I'm going to show you the work of two contemporary artists, and I'm pleased to introduce particularly the theoretician Sergei Chakotyn, who I'll talk about. So if you look at this very well-known futurist work by Umberto Boccioni as early as 1910, a huge contrast with the previous image. You can see from today's point of view almost algorithms in motion. When one normally studies futurism, we talk about lines of force. But this way in which horses as men and the emotions of riot are represented, I think looks in many ways, apart from the horses perhaps extremely topical. And already with Carlo Carra's work here, which is called The Funeral of the Anarchist Gallo, what is interesting, and what Walter Benjamin is later going to talk about, is in crowds the mixture of emotions. There are people who are in mourning for the death of their leader. But of course, the police repression provokes anger and violence. So the problem is that the mixture of emotions are always very important in representing the crowd. And then, of course, in thinking about how to theorize this. And even in Cubism, I remember my first time I saw this painting, which is in the Pompidou Center. It's called La Noce, the wedding. I really didn't understand these nasty little men with fists you can see behind the surface of this, which is supposed to be almost like the white of a woman's body. What are those nasty little men up to there? I'm afraid to say I believe they are men. And this is because at this time, you're in a situation where there is going to be this theorization of the crowd. I'll get back to it, to the futurist moment in a second. Now, first of all, the representation of the crowd goes back a very long way. And this is a very, very famous frontispiece for Thomas Hobbes's work, Leviathan. He was an author writing in the English Civil War, which is, as you know, when they first cut the head of a king off. And this is a representation, if you like, of benign monarchy, the idea of the body politic, where the benign ruler, or in this case monarch, is actually embracing everybody into this idea of a reign. All the people are looking up to him. And of course, this, as an idea, does not have a very, very long shelf life, the divine monarchy side of it. But what Hobbes was actually doing was trying to discuss the structure of legitimate government. If we zoom to the early 19th century, looking back at things, that idea simply of the masses and good government collapses when you get very, very strange things happening. So this crazy Scottish, well, not crazy, but this rather eccentric Scottish theoretician called Charles Mackay wrote this book called Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds. Because even if you think of Dutch Protestant capitalism, the fact that everyone went absolutely crazy about tulips, and tulips were the most precious commodity, the tulip craze, is something that he discusses. He also discusses alchemy. He discusses the craze for people going on the crusades and all sorts of other things. So the idea that the crowds, and even at the highest level of businessmen, can be deluded is a very interesting interim moment before the great theoretician, who's so much better known, who introduces already, a burgeoning 19th century discipline, the idea that there must be such a thing as group psychology. Gustave Le Bon, The Psychology of Crowds. Of course, I'm just giving you titles. You can look back and Google all these things. You'll have my presentation stuck in your computer. But the idea that there's psychology, and the idea that immediately the police force and the military are going to think, this is for the military, this is a very different idea from the simple Napoleonic idea of the esprit du corps, making all the soldiers obey the captain, which is the spirit of the body of soldiers. So the psychology of crowd, and every single book, I've tried to find the first edition, image-wise, but all these great books go into multiple editions and come out again and again and are read again and again. In fact, even that isn't the first edition. I think that's like the 29th edition of Gustave Le Bon's Psychology of Crowds. So one goes from that to two publications that come out, that come out simultaneously with those futurist works I was showing you. One is the concept, promoted by the poet Jules Romain, called unanisme, which is the same as the English word unanimous, everybody with one soul. And he writes in these poems about he introduces in a very modern way into his poetry, just as Giacomo Ballo was introducing electric light. He introduces electricity and even motor cars and the explosions inside the guts of motor cars into this poem, which is talking about particles and seeing people and their desires as well as particles of a greater crowd. So he is doing that from a poetic point of view, but at the same time, Georges Sorel is the first theoretician of violence, and here the actual author is a political revolutionary, a political anarcho-syndicalist, who is the first person to write about violence, and here's the person that Walter Benjamin reads when Walter Benjamin in 1921 writes The Psychology of Violence. But then, something which was interesting for me when I was writing my book about Picasso and Marx, when Benjamin is a Jewish exile who's had to flee Germany and is part of a community of 40,000 Jewish exiles in Paris, he witnesses the Popular Front, not only the very happy processions of people who here, these are artists and writers inscribing themselves into a great tradition going back to Voltaire and Courbet, Signac, who was going to Russia at this time, happy, peaceful, proud procession. But by 1937, when there have been strikes that have involved police brutality, and this is another mourning, this is the same as the anarchist Gallo funeral, this is another funeral demonstration where there is group mourning, group outrage, and potential violence. He asked this very interesting question. There's a wonderful article called Walter Benjamin, Reader of Georges Sorel, and Benjamin asks, when and under what conditions a legal action must convert itself into an illegal action, and an illegal action into a violent act. So that's very interesting. And by the time he's writing, the very largely immigré school of Paris is in a very perilous situation. And I can't give you a whole lecture on the School of Paris, let alone in 10 minutes. But for example, Jacques Lifshitz, who'd come from Lithuania, whose work was very specifically anti-fascist, David and Goliath, Prometheus, disguised as the Nazi eagle and so forth, he has actually made it to being super rich with a wonderful villa designed by Le Corbusier. The rich, successful Jewish émigré artists of the School of Paris. And remember, the School of Paris is a euphemism for immigré and largely Jewish artists, people like Chagall, Modigliani. He would be able to go to New York, whereas the poor ones were basically deported and exterminated. So one's talking about very, very serious things. Remember, the poet Heinrich Heine said, first come books, then come people. And at this time, there is a huge Russophilia and, well, Sovietophilia and Sovietophobia, which is a big debate in Paris at the time because there's anti-Nazism and pro-communism happening. And what did this say? Oh, this is about that émigré stuff. Yes, I've just said that to you. There were huge, immigrant communities in the car plants in Billancourt, the cinema, and so forth, as well as fine arts. But, for example, Nikolai Berdyaev was the person who, as an émigré white Russian theologian, was trying to say, look, let's look at communism as a system and see how it's actually a tracing of the psychological structures and the eschatological structures of Christianity, with poor people getting their rewards in heaven, as no jam tomorrow, as it says in Alice in Wonderland. And so he was writing in Catholic circles, your great friend, I have the greatest admiration and respect for Ilya Ehrenberg, for what he did at the end of his life. He was doing the most extraordinary propaganda number, doing his My Paris, just taking photos of tramps and alcoholics and people being very, very miserable at this time, as a kind of, to show the Soviet Union what a wonderful contrast Moscow was. But much more to the point is the huge Comintern operation that's going on all over Europe, which I'm very, very interested in. So Willy Munzenberg is the person who moves from being Stalin's man in Berlin after the Reichstag fire and the persecution of German communists to Paris to mastermind the whole of the Comintern operation in Paris. But things get worse and worse. And finally, by 1937, he's allying himself with the German socialists in Paris. And finally, as a culmination of the expose of all his previous techniques, he publishes this book, and you can see Édition du Carrefour. This is published in Paris by a French publishing house, Propaganda as a Weapon. And of course, he is assassinated by 1940 in horrible circumstances. Well, everything by 1940 is very dreadful, with internment camps for all foreigners and so forth. But he was obviously assassinated by Stalin's henchmen, as it were. But he is quoted, because this is an absolutely groundbreaking book, he is quoted in the book that I want to promote in my lecture, which is Chakutin's Rape of the Crowd by Political Propaganda. Now, this is a very different kind of title from Propaganda as a Weapon. This is saying, what does this do to people? Now, I don't know what the word is. You're going to be able to tell me at the end of my lecture for the word rape in Russian. But viol is not violation. The root of viol, like you can violate a treaty, and that's not as aggressive or indeed as sexualized as the word viol. He really talks about the way that people are mind-raped by propaganda. And of course, this book was instantly pulped when the Nazis invaded. The whole of the communist press, but this wasn't the communist press, was instantly non-available after 1939 and its publication. But it's going to come back. So one of the things he promoted was, for example, having counter symbols. He invented this idea of 3 arrows to whop things, but that is not very clever. It wasn't sophisticated enough, just to show you that, of course, in terms of what happened to Paris and in terms of the power of symbols, poor old Serge Chakutin didn't actually triumph. After the war, these things happen, which I have to zoom over, but there are certain key moments where discourse is affecting the artistic production. Of course, the Holocaust and how to respond adequately to it is the hugest question. This is personal experience by David Rousset, who would later become the great expose of the Soviet Gulag in publications from the 1950s onwards. And of course, it relates very immediately to the work of someone like Giacometti, whose work Sartre said reminded him of the martyrs of Buchenwald. One thing that I found very interesting in my research, this isn't part of the great chain of publications, but this book about how, this was in 1949, after a lot of Gestapo torture in Paris, and before the French said, what a good idea, let's torture everybody in Algeria, which I'm coming to in a second. This is, what was interesting for me is how torture was conceived of as something entirely medieval that had completely died out and wouldn't start up again, until it was very carefully and cleverly and powerfully used by totalitarian governments of either disposition in the 1930s. And we get to 1951, and Serge has been busily adding to this book. So this second edition is very, very, very much, it's got 300 extra pages added to it, which of course I can't synopsize, but it comes out just before the debates in Paris, where the country is completely divided in an almost civil war type of debate to do with Algeria, whether it's a French province, whether it deserves liberty. And the torn poster artists are specifically address themselves to the notion of propaganda and psychic propaganda, and indeed torture, not just mind rape, but the torture of bodies. Because on the one hand, this electoral poster torn by Villeglé says this man is dangerous, okay, and defacing photos is what, defacing posters is what was done as an anti-Nazi act during the occupation. But here, this was an advert for a swimming pool. But you can see this man is actually looking as though he's having that torture where you're, waterboarded. And this is just called the 14th of July, this work. So there's a happy 14th of July thing, a protest for peace in Algeria, and that at the same time. Just to show you how thinking about propaganda and what it does to bodies and minds is something that can enter explicitly into an exhibition. And as you can see, the exhibition was a pun, France Torn Apart. The idea of the torn poster and tearing the nation apart, coming together in 1961. And of course, it's something that goes on. I must emphasize that this is a right-wing poster. I'm very pro-Macron, of course, but the right-wing is saying that he is, and the left, because it's a very complicated situation, is saying that the Marianne Le Pen project underneath Macron. But you can see the Communist Party there, making itself the shield of the Marianne figure, the figure of France. So always, of course, you can do double speak, as George Orwell said, in these things. So the next most famous book about crowds and the kind of metamorphosis of the argument happens with Elias Canetti. And what I think is very interesting is that from Gustave Le Bon, who himself was shocked to see the masses become so violent, to burn down the Tuileries, to burn down all the monuments in the middle of Paris, just before he started writing his thing. Canetti, like Freud, saw the Anschluss of Austria, saw all the soldiers coming in, and saw all the cheering crowds. And this is what really impelled him in exile as a Jewish Austrian, in exile in London, to write his very famous book, Crowds and Power. First of all, he wrote this this is an amazing image on the front of it, this very powerful novel, as early as 1935, and then this thing went into many, many editions. And what was strange for me, before I read this, I thought it was going to be far less anthropological. He's almost disguising his personal agenda and his passion with anthropology. But the interesting thing is, of course, he is by default post-Freudian. The previous people, including Chacotin, whom I've mentioned to you, are not, as it were, post-Freudian. As an Austrian, even as a he's not an anthropologist, as a writer using anthropology, he's of necessity post-Freudian. A non-theoretician, but a moment we must pause on. And strangely enough, this film by Stanley Kubrick, The Clockwork Orange, is just being restored, and there are posters for it all over London at the moment. This was a book that came out in '63, and what was funny, it was not funny, it's the height of the Cold War. Kubrick almost imagines that Russia has taken over England, and for example, when he says the word for friend is drug, so he uses this kind of Russian speak in The Clockwork Orange. And of course, this has got all sorts of shocking brainwashing stuff in it. As you know, this horrible moment is accompanied by Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. But that is an important little kind of punctum in an argument where brainwashing enters big time. And I'm not going into all sorts of things, but one of the next things is really, really important, and it's probably something that many of you have not come across. You know that there are you might think very boring arguments about feminism and post-feminism and Russian women having responsible jobs in the Soviet time. This isn't the problem. The problem today, and to do with leaders and crowds and power, goes back to the construction of masculinity. This was not given any thought, in particular in feminist things, until this man, Klaus Theolite, in East Germany, came across some diaries of young boys who'd been turned into fascists. And in 1978, he published this 2-volume, very serious study called Male Fantasies, in which the most extraordinary misogyny and desire for blood were part of a construction of the strong, impermeable, internally armored masculine fighter. And this really revolutionized English literature studies and all sorts of other studies, historical studies. It's a very important book, which can also be applied to fashion theory and male fashions and so forth, if you want to. But this is a really important book because before that, even the very phrase, maybe I can teach you a really good phrase, the construction of masculinity, not just womanliness as a masquerade. We know this very famous text about how women perform their womanhood, going back to 1920s, but how masculinity is a performance and a duress and a stress and something acquired as well, very important. And so I just wanted to end very briefly, and I'm probably shooting over time, with two contemporary artists. You can read the things. Martin Dudek. These works were exhibited by Polish artists in London in 2017, before part of the Brexit arguments turned into anti-Polish arguments because of the immense amount of Eastern European immigration we have enjoyed and been enriched by since 2011. And what is interesting about this guy, very briefly, because I'm speeding up, is that he is a former Polish football hooligan who uses hooliganism and masculinity and what it means as part of his art. So here we have these are the trousers of his brother turned into sculpture, and a kind of turnstile you have to go to get into the exhibition. And the orange is like a very emotional color, but also the color of fans' anoraks. And there's another installation. I don't know what I'm saying down there, but you can read it in Russian. These are photos, like a kind of very pixelated on-off video, in fact, of a photojournal he took through a whole year of these assemblies, police, repression, riots, football, whatever. But it was very, very spectacular, actually, even on a small screen. And then these were his own kind of photo journal he made as a very young man. He was from quite a poor place, brought up in a housing block, you know, with very few recreational facilities. So football becomes this big thing of male bonding and so forth. And here again, his experience of a particular match in, I've got it down here, oh golly, what match was it? Poland versus Romania. And I've also mentioned another American theorist he found particularly inspiring, Raymond Monbois, Riots, Revolts, and Insurrections. Obviously, this was even more interesting. This is where he actually does a kind of hooligan act as a performance in a gallery. On the one hand, this is retrospectively amusing in a certain way. On another hand, it isn't, because in terms of the things like the adrenaline he experienced when he was involved in this in the past, and the adrenaline in the present, and the move into the gallery, it offers all sorts of questions. Incidentally, the London Gallery was one of my former students, and the artist I'm next going to show is also, and this is interesting from a Russian point of view, this is his balaclava football helmet. The idea of turning the crowd into anonymous people, where you lose your individuality and become one of the mass, is interesting. But this is funny, because this is a former Soviet army helmet that all the police in Poland used to wear to bash people up with, apparently. And he's actually done a model of the football stadium inside this army helmet. So that was a particularly interesting sculptural piece in the show. But this, at the same time, in this other gallery called Copperfield, run by a former student of ours, William Dunn, was a marvelous female artist. And I think the fact that women artists can be involved in this question, just as I am speaking about it, is very important. So I want to promote Eva Axelrad and her very complex but beautiful exhibition called Sztama, which is a funny word in Polish, which means kind of boys getting together. And of course, I can't show her video, which you can see there, which looks on the one hand like a crown of thorns, and it's actually men's arms when they all dance around together. There's this torso, there's this idea of batons, made with things. And for her, reading William Golding's Lord of the Flies when she was a little girl was very important, and perhaps that was also a kind of classic translated into Russian. The Catholic dimension, which is part of Polish racism, is very, and Polish anti-Semitism is important, and this way that this uniform is almost like flesh, and the way that in the video there's this putting the finger into the flesh, almost like putting the finger into Christ's wound, is very interesting in her work. And there were finally these kind of miniature sculptures with these horrible pseudo-swastika elements on them that I'm just showing you very briefly. There's a funny problem here where 37 and 38 slogans got lost, and this was to show Polish fascists. And the next one was, which I find all very frightening. I mean, this is before Brexit. When I saw things like this, I couldn't believe it when my Polish friends sent this to me. Now we have the same thing. But this one, which says English fascists, I believe says Polish. I think there's a mistake down here. Anyway, in England, we're having exactly the same problem. These are early, pre-Brexit, you know, swastikas galore, not in the middle of London, but in disaffected and underfunded places, all men mostly. But you can see when it gets to Brexit, we have our female figures very, very involved. And it is very worrying how the insignia, the flag, the violence and the thing all gets together, and how there is this parallel. This is England, this is London, with people actually fighting each other. This is happening at this very moment. And here you have Paris. I mean, it's a shocking image. So the fact is, it's the history of the representation of this and the relationship between fine art and propaganda and what is actually happening is extremely strange. We'll have to see what comes out of this and wonder what subjects will be next year. So what did I want to say at the end? Yes, I thought that whereas I began with me, you'd far prefer me to end with Benedict Cumberbatch rather than me. But this was a very interesting, this is very important, this was a very interesting TV thing where he actually played the nerd who actually ran the Brexit campaign. We won't go into the psychology of this person called Dominic Cummings, but it was very evenly balanced, very important. I'm ending with him, as it were, for people who are fond of Benedict Cumberbatch and see how he is contributing in his own way to a very complex psychological reading of the debate. And this is my latest heroine. She only appeared about 3 days ago. This is the woman who's just got the Guardian Award for Journalism. And she is the woman who spent over a year tracing and finally exposing the firm that was disguised with this title, Cambridge, sounds very nice, Cambridge Analytica, that were related to all sorts of data manipulation. 40% of the Brexit campaign money was spent on data manipulation. And you see, the point is that Vote Leave, as is proven, committed crimes for which they have not been persecuted, electoral fraud. There are all these other things you can read as well. But this is the woman, so, you know, a single individual woman can make the most huge difference. This really exposed the whole thing. And that's what I think is so, heartening from that point of view, but very important. And this is the final slide, because I think it's very, very significant that only in 2016, for the very first time, has Chakutin been translated into Russian. Now, I'm not going to talk about all the kind of things that have been happening in Russia over the last even 5 years, but you can see, I wonder who the publisher was and what the decision was to publish it, that this is a very, very pertinent publication, 2016. Just to add a bit of color, that's Brazil, 1967. But my main desire was to link contemporary art and contemporary questions in politics to the fact of these theoreticians, this debate, and the fact that Chakutin, whom may be unfamiliar to you, is a very, very important participant who is, if you like, my present to the Congress. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Sarah, for very interesting presentation. Now, any questions? Yes, please.
I think it's rather a remark. Maybe there are questions.
I have one question.
Yes.
Recently, we were discussing the issue. Really, the presentation was very interesting, and there are a lot of things which are interesting. But last week, we had a big discussion between ourselves during discussing absolutely different thing. We were discussing the book on propaganda. And as today, you mentioned many times the word propaganda, and in a way, it is a lot in the context of your presentation. We were at a loss what to do because we couldn't find. What we found in the Google, the explanation and definition of propaganda was the explanation of the facts, which is absolutely...
But that's like saying Pravda is a great newspaper, isn't it?
What do you... how can you explain what propaganda is and what is the difference between explaining and propaganda?
Well, I think it's very interesting because your question goes back to this word scientific that people are very keen on using in conferences. Scientific as a means of research, which is not the way that it's used in England, means empirical probity in looking at results and input and results and so forth. And the problem is that you can even take Hobbes' Leviathan as propaganda. The idea is that there is a notional neutrality somewhere, which it is the whole problem of the hostility to deconstruction. Actually, deconstruction is highly empirical in terms of looking for a truth, which is not there in the surface. But obviously, I'm not talking about a thing saying vote Brexit versus the actual reasons. I think that once you get to media of communication, which have an effect on people's emotions and their desires and their level of education, let alone other questions like their gender, there's the whole business of reception. I think one could say propaganda is a use of communication, skillfully using media that wants to sway people's minds in a certain direction. It could be any direction, which is different from an empirical expose of the facts. But even empirical, in Brexit, the problem is there has been no detailed empirical expose of the facts, and many of them are based on economic predictions. But even the actual facts about what will happen in airports were never made clear when people first took this so-called democratic vote.
Thank you very much. And the last question, also connected with propaganda. When propaganda appeared?
When did it appear?
Yeah.
Probably with the early Christians in ancient Rome. I mean, it's a very long story.
So, thank you very much.
I think once you have your tools...
Thank you. It's one of the our suggestions. Thank you.
Yes.
Well, thank you very much for your presentation. We of course feel for you and the situation with Brexit. We feel for ourselves being also subjected to propaganda. But if I kind of try and distance the actual moment, the actual politics and the research, and your research about Sergei Chakotyn, or Chakotyn, however you pronounce him, you reminded us that he was a Ivan Pavlov student. And of course, Pavlov's theory of conditional reflexes, as well as Bekhteyev's theory of reflexology, was used in the scientific approach to propaganda, which was forming in the early 20s in the Soviet Union. And what is interesting that reflexology and the theory of conditional reflexes was equally used in theater by theater directors like Meyerhold and Ivan Stanislavski. And it actually brings us back, brings the topic of performativity and performance into your study, because this is my favorite toy, performance.
Including this idea of performing gender, which precedes performing
gender, but also performing rage or performing discipline.
Yes.
And is there a way where you can bring this crowd crowd manifestations, whatever.
If you were coming to me, obviously we don't know each other, I would say, were you to come to me in a tutorial? Sometimes I say things off the top of my head, but sometimes they're good and sometimes they're not. But what I would do would think of the exhibition I participated in a long time ago called Art and Science, L'Amour Corps, Art and Science, 1792 to 1992, in which Jean-Claire, the curator, was very eager to show how the theory of the humours, where they were represented by animals, you know, the lion, the wolf, and so forth, preceded the Cartesian, which takes us back to the fact that we're animals, for starters. And I think that I mean, what's interesting is when things become useful and when things become rediscovered. But the fact that people behaved like animals or people were animals, you don't need Darwin for that. That goes back a very long way. And so I was also very interested when I tried to research the actual real origins of reflection theory, that there were two Pavlovs, actually, one in Bulgaria, and they were both interested in this idea. I'm going to get lost and forget my details, but I think the fact that of animality and conditioned reflexes and things is very important. And the fact that all these disciplines come in, you know, psychology, Freud, and so forth, consecutively is interesting. Now we're in a... But of course, to look at it from what the Russians and the French would call a scientific point of view, to look at this cumulative body of theory doesn't help if you are an uneducated, very, very poor Brexit voter in the north of England whose emotions for voting have got nothing to do with the actual legal facts. So it's a really dreadful question. But I mean, it is to do with the fact that democracy for this expanded population is not working anymore. But I'm a bit worried about time and other participants. Perhaps we should go on.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Vlad, you wanted to ask something, the last question.
Hi, Sarah. Thanks for the wonderful lecture. A very quick question about a disappearance of a word, and the word is the masses. It got studied in the 1990s. The word has kind of began to disappear from the British discourse, you know, in newspapers, etc. We stopped saying the word the masses. And in your lecture, you kept using the word the crowd, right? Which obviously reminds me of that wonderful exhibition at the Whitechapel Gallery, The Face in the Crowd. So I wonder if the crowd is a new kind of polite neoliberal way of talking about the masses, or is that really a way to suggest a new kind of thinking, where it's even more chaotic, not economically kind of grounded?
I just think in England, masses is very politically connotated and was very kind of post-communist and lefty. And people are now more interested in looking at like helicopter photos of thousands of people. 1 million people were supposed to have demonstrated, which really goes beyond the word crowd. I think I was psychologically using the word crowd because of crowds and power. But even when people are just doing algorithms to look at people moving in the London Underground, they're not talking about crowds. I think crowds is also a word that has been dépassé by events. I think events have taken over. I think the word crowd is too small. So I mean, I don't see we can go back to the word masses, but I think we're more into talking about statistics. You know, 1 million people turned up to protest. But it's a good question.
Thank you very much.